So now, how are we gonna, what is the way we're going to, first of all, how many of the people that are here were here at the church the other day? Almost everybody. Okay, so best is to start with that, because some of these things you can get on internet, and I'm actually alive here. And if you actually experience something, then maybe we could talk about it, because the problem, we were just talking with that, what's your sociologist friend yesterday? Icho. We were talking about it, is that, like the last two performances that I gave, let's see where my camera is here. Oh, it's there. So we can see me and the backs of you. Perfect. We were talking about it because the last two performances that I gave, one was in Innsbruck a few days ago on a carillon, which is a bell instrument that's up in a church tower. And we had all these people down in a very nice square, also in a St. Jacob's church. Are you okay? What's the problem?
Just with the sound, I'm sorry. I will just like this.
Okay. So that was at St. Jacob's, and it was a carillon, and I was all the way up in the tower that took about 15 minutes to get to. So after it's finished, I asked them to film it, but normally I like to have some relationship like we're having now. And the other night also, that church where I was playing the organ, also St. Jacob's, it's there's a kind of a wooden filigree in front of where the organ plays, and so I didn't have any contact with you guys. And actually, normally I do start downstairs from time to time I would have started downstairs, but we've been traveling for 3 weeks. I have a big show up in Vienna, and in Innsbruck I had to go up and down this tower 3 times, and so I was actually tired. Otherwise, you would have seen me, and I would have seen you before I started. That's normally how I like to do it, because then I know I'm going to go up to the bird's nest there, and then I won't see you anymore. Though in some churches you can, if it doesn't have that filigree, you're up. So what I mean to say, position is quite important, especially in works like mine, because I'm a very physical guy. And so that's the paradox of playing what I call the greatest synthesizers in the world. That's what I call organs. That I didn't have any physical contact with you. So now I do, and so that's why I was thinking, let's start with that, because that's where I came first, and you've already heard that, and maybe you have some questions and things, and then afterwards we can see some movies, and
maybe
and you can even ask me some questions if you want.
Yeah.
It looks like you're in the question.
Yeah.
You're in the question place.
Since you mentioned the performance.
Yeah. Wait, I want to see. Can you see the video camera from where you are?
No. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I do.
No. So put yourself exactly. So
I do.
Usually it works that if you see it,
Yeah.
it sees you. I
Yeah.
found that happens very often.
Yeah, that's true.
And so I've used it because I don't like to use mathematical principles. But if it's you see it, it sees you, and that works. That's a simple, much more simple way. So you're going to ask me some questions.
You asked me after the performance. You asked me interesting thing. You said that you got the feeling during the performance that the public on the concert were more keen to have a beginning, middle, and the end.
No, I think you said that. And then I said, yeah, because you know this public. I don't know. How would I know that from being all the way upstairs?
No.
But, and then, we were talking about it, because you came up sort of perplexed a little bit because they didn't know how to clap at the end, and you thought, and then I started to sing. What was that about? Where was that in the program? Is he supposed to sort of sing like that? you know, things like, you know, see, this is the kind of guy I am. I never say what exact, I call a piece, name of a piece, and then it's an incomprehensible name often, and then you don't know, is it going to be in several sections, or is it one section, and you don't know that. And actually, to be honest, I don't often know either, because I do it in the moment. And so there was, to bring up that point.
Yeah, you said that you were then playing with the ambiguity of situation.
Well, something like that. But we were just talking about yesterday about, like my approach is a very in the moment approach, just like how we just started now. And then I found out, I thought, why is that camera guy so absurd? He's an Irish. Okay, so and that's part of my presentation. I mean, I don't want you to think that was the pre-presentation. You can already consider that a part of this morning's presentation. If anybody says in YouTube, well, first, you know, he was talking to the photographer. No, you say it started by him talking to the photographer and confronting the photographer, and so we can already consider this the event. No, but that's an important difference of what I do and some other people do, is that I like to be in the moment, and things begin as they begin. And normally I like even things to begin before they begin. So when you come in, they've already begun. Does that make any sense?
It does.
Okay. So that's why too, when they were going to have a speech, like I don't usually like speeches in my thing, but so I said, well, if I make the noise up and the thing going wee, and I don't know how you guys heard the speech downstairs. I couldn't. I just heard because the sound was too. I said, is that okay? Because I don't like there's a speech and then I begin, because that comes very early in my work, is that I like it as a continuum, and so continuums continue, and they don't. If a continuum decontinues, it means there's something wrong. It doesn't mean that it's over. For other people, yes, it's just over. Yeah, but I don't like over, so it's just. So.
And this continuum.
Okay, but we already talked about that. Yeah, they got it. Okay. Let's go on to next.
Yeah, you mentioned event. So how does this apply to your video work?
What does event mean? Lately I've been I'm like a little child now. I've been what is an event? What does that mean? And you know, there are words I've been hearing and using since I'm a little child, but lately maybe it's some kind of Alzheimer that I'm getting. But I really like, all of a sudden I use a word, and that's why now I use all these different words with 3 T's and 6 M's, and so it ambiguates all the possibilities. But what does like event come from?
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I mean,
does anybody know what event means? I mean, it means événement in French. It means something that will happen. Événement. So event is something that will happen. So, okay.
Yeah.
Which already happened.
Which already happened. So
it was on Friday.
Yeah.
And now we're Sunday.
Yeah.
Okay, great.
So I wanted to ask
Reality
you,
check.
how does this transfer?
You know, when you're traveling a lot, you lose track of we're in hotels and different places now for 3 weeks. You lose track of when it's Sunday and Friday and which day. More than if you're at home and you have all the things, regular things around you that give you sort of like your time and place.
So I wonder, how does this apply with your video work? You know, you have a camera, you have to start.
Well, this was a very long time ago.
Yeah.
I mean, now I have that little camera there that's documenting. This piece, I'm going to play 2, which is one of my earliest ones that were more than 40 years old, that were done with one of the earliest video art companies that ever existed. And just to imagine how well that system went, I was one of the first people to work in this video art system commercially. This was a commercial company from Florence, Italy, called Art Tapes, and they eventually did 100 tapes, and then they went out of business. And there were so many other companies that decided to continue in that way. Castelli Sonoband and Electronic Arts Intermix now exists. There were some companies here and there in the world, but video art especially never made it as in this case, when I made these tapes, they're called Body Music 1 and Body Music 2. And they were made, this one was made in Paris in a room somewhere during a Festival d'Automne. It was Ileana Sonoband, who was a very important gallerist of the 70s and after. She just died about 10 years ago. She was approached by these people, Art Tapes Florence, who had bought some equipment. I don't know if any of you know Italian futurism, a little bit, 20th century futurism. The woman who started it was the daughter of Primo Conti, who was a rather important Florence futurist, Italian futurist. So it was an artist family. And she was into the new media. And so the new media meant all these big porta-packs, Sony porta-packs. I don't know, some of you would remember what that was like, and they weighed a ton. And the cables, that was one of the pieces, maybe I'll play the others. The cables were thick like this, not thin like that. And so that was the new technology, is that an artist could then work directly with, and it's not film. So what happened is that then eventually I became my own, I hated, one thing that you'll find that's similar to my works even 45 years later is that I don't edit. It's in real time. It works or it doesn't work. Sometimes we do sometimes like make sure that the sounds or the images, but it's always in real time. So that hasn't changed. From this piece that will start, that comes from 73, or I think it'll say, I forget if it's 73 or 74, until the piece you heard on Friday, no editing. If we find that we like the work, maybe we'll edit out the non-applause that you did afterwards. Or maybe we'll put it in because it was such a non-applause and he got up, we weren't sure what that was. So that might be even a reason to keep it in, because then it makes it into some sort of strange, ambiguous communication that we had. Oh good, that's good. Now it's very, maybe I'll touch this, otherwise I'll fall asleep. It's like back in the 60s. I feel like I'm having an LSD thing. So I never edit. I mean, we read, sometimes, like I say, enhance, if I come out with a record, because now I have lots of records, I used to have none. But I don't redo, I don't cut, normally I don't like to cut out. And so that's an attitude, even when I've now come out with works by other musicians, and like Rhys Chatham or Zev or Perlinex or Tony Conrad or whatever. Like, the deal is we don't edit it. If we don't like it, we throw it out. We do like it. And most of the time, well, that's my specialty. I'm in the moment, and when I'm in the moment, I sort of am able to do things that I can't do when I'm out of the moment. I get into a trance, and then time passes in a sort of magical way. And so even this piece, I had no idea more or less what I was going to do. I'd never done a video before with my body in this as a piece. Now in this what's called Body Music 1. And so we're in this, I was invited to the Festival at Tom with this woman who I worked with for over 40 years, a conceptual dancer artist from the Judson, if any of you know the Judson movement in New York dance, Yvonne Rainer, Tricia Brown, Lucinda Charles, and Simone Forti. Simone Forti and I worked together over these last 45 years. Even recently, there's been a sort of, we were given a sort of, people want to see this piece again, which we started in 1970, and it was called Illuminations. Now I call it Illuminations, and you have to see that there are lots of S's, lots of I's, lots of L's, lots of M's, but that's another typical part of the way that I like to work. I come up with a title, and then the title continues like it's like a planet. It's not a title, it's a planet, and then all pieces in that sort of realm are those. It's like Schlingenblangen is what I came up with for the organ piece in the 70s, and people ask me, well, what does that mean? And so actually it doesn't. Well, it has a certain, I'll explain, but my reason for inventing such a kind of title is that I had sort of like joking with, you know, all the titles of Boulez and Stockhausen and Berio and Xenakis especially. They had all these like, what I found to be incomprehensible titles, though they always had these sort of scientific or philosophical or entomological reasons why it had to be called that. So I said, oh, well, let me do, you know, my sort of way, but in a sort of Brooklyn funny way. And so I came up with Schlingenblangen, and then it became Schlang, Schling, Schlang, and Schlang in Yiddish means like a penis. And so, and as an organ has many penises, which sonore at the same time, it was my title is equally as fundamentally intelligent and comprehensible as their titles. You know, so I've always sort of used titles in a funny way, but realms. So pieces like Schlingenblangen, I've probably done hundreds and hundreds of them. But then they're always in a different place, on a different organ, in a different way, a different length. But they're my schlings. And so they said, well, you want to do a schling? You want to do a strum? Yeah, then I have my strumming. Came up with that word around 73. But it was sort of like, I started to do that technique I do when I like repeat a little bit like bell ringing technique, but you play notes one after the other, and so what would be the title for that? Because before that I was doing a lot of arpeggios when I was living in California, and then I came to New York, and back to New York because I'm from New York. At Cal Arts I was in California, and so that was my arpeggios, that very weather is always nice, everybody's blonde. In those days, it was before the Hispanic infiltration of, and so it was very arpeggios. But then I came back to New York, and I started to also continue pieces, and all of a sudden these arpeggios sounded so foodie-doody. I was embarrassed. I couldn't stand to listen to them and then walk out onto the New York traffic jam. So they became, and this is really like, these are my compositional techniques, really. So that's why I tell you, because not everybody has their particular. So what happened is that maybe the New York traffic jams developed my piano technique, and it became strumming. And strumming was so I forget how because we were trying to find a name, because I like titles that are funny and also like dance off your tongue. So I came up with, I don't remember how, but strumming became. And then, and now everybody talks, that was the technique that I did, and so even just last 2 weeks ago, no, not even a week and a half ago, we opened a show in Vienna at the Kunsthalle. I have this big piece, if ever you have I can do some advertising. If ever you have the time to go to Vienna the next 2 months, come and see my piece, which is called Gesamtkunstmischuggerland. I don't know if you all know what that sort of means, but Gesamtkunst is actually a total artwork. It came out of the secession, and a little before even the secession line. But it was the idea that a lot of architects came out with that idea, and it was about, but it also Wagner, in the time of Wagner, it was a total theater piece. But it means that a total artwork. And as I did the piece, my show is right across the street in a diagonal from the secession in Vienna, and it's all glass windows, so I can actually see, one can actually see the secession. I don't know if you all know the architecture of the secession, with the golden ball above it. That was done in 1902 by Obrecht, the architect for this new movement, which was eventually to be Joseph Hoffman, Gustav Klimt, Charlemagne Moser, Karl Tschetschka, and it lasted for about 30 years. And it was about doing total art, a total work. If you built a house, it was also all the chairs, all the furniture, all the door handles, all the rugs, everything. And so the term then came into plastic arts and not just theater like Wagner used it. So as my piece is across the street from where that started, and my wife in her family has a sort of World Heritage Gesamtkunstwerk in Brussels called the Palais Stockberg in the family. That word has become now part of my, because people of my generation, we called ourselves multimedia, which is such a poopy word. Gesamtkunst. Is that Gesamtkunstwerk? It's so much more exciting. It's voluptuous. But I didn't know that word back then. I would have used it years before, but in New York, you didn't use that. I mean, it would have been considered pretentious. But maybe it still is, but here in Europe, it's just so delicious. I love the word. So anyway, the piece became, they asked me to do this sort of like a schmetrospective. I always make fun of that word because I'm superstitious, and I don't like things like one, so I say Schmun Man Show, and I say retrospective, and I do that because it worries me. It's like I'm afraid if you say a certain thing that's too, in the end, then the gods will think it's over and you'll die. So I'm that kind of guy. I'm very superstitious somewhere, and so I'm afraid to say things that apply to the end. I mean, like not so far after. From the Doors, what was the name of the singer of the Doors?
Jim Morrison.
Jim Morrison, not so far after that famous song, The End, it was. So I'm allergic.
So you wouldn't name The End?
No, I wouldn't name The End until I might put it in an envelope after my death.
Yeah.
You could call that The End, but I want to already be gone before I say, no, things like that. So this is this schmetrospective that I have now at, or Schwan-Man show in Vienna, needed a title. So it became, I used two actually Austrian terms, Gesamtkunst, and the other one, which comes from Yiddish, is Meshuggah, and Meshuggah means crazy in Yiddish, in a nice way, sort of. And in fact, it's still in Austrian. I mean, when I first proposed that title, everybody every generation knew that word, even though there were hardly any more Jews in Austria, but the word stayed. So it became Gesamtkunst Mischuckerland. And so...
you mentioned yesterday that this is what interests you now, to make more of them. Like to combine all of your work.
Yeah, but that was what interested me at the beginning.
Yeah.
But when you said multimedia, I mean, it seems to work now. I'm a certain age. There's internet. There are young people, because everybody, I seem to have felt so much resistance when I was young. I mean, the whole atmosphere, even though it's as rigid now as it was then, to try to do something total, they're always trying to put you into a category, which I hate. Life is a category. I think death is a category. Okay, those are categories I'm okay with, but it's trying to specify that really. Maybe this is a good time to, let's see. Imagine that in this room, it's a square room, and there are like two guys from Calabria with a big porta-pack system with these, what I was telling you, they were cables about as thick as these. And they didn't know that the piece, and I didn't know the piece was gonna go how it went. And so they were like turning like this, following me the whole time, and the cables at the end, they were afraid because it was like those snakes that they became totally embedded in this sea of cables more and more. So the two of them were totally at the end happily had finished. I was like that, and they were like this, with these enormous cables all around them in a spiral. So you never know. And if, I mean, it's funny because now, in the technology, it's so different. So in those days, these things weighed also, 20 kilos, because the next piece I'll do, there's one that I carry the cameras myself. So does anybody have any observations or things they wanted to ask about Friday, the work that they heard? I mean, did it sound like an organ? I mean, from where you were also, because from where you were and from where I was, I noticed like the other day, I made a little cameroscope, the same cameroscope, that was downstairs. And then I had my little Etero near to the organ itself, and the acoustics of that space were very, very special. Well, as all, especially churches and places like that haven't tried to make their acoustics neutral, which I hate actually. But I mean, for my particular work, it's neutral. Is very. I always think of it as, I use the word now, condom. It's like playing in a condom space. It's like nothing can sort of break out. Does anybody have any? Did any of you know what you're going to hear and had already heard some of the records and then heard it live, or was just any observation at all?
Yeah, I thought live was really different. Like I thought I heard something extra, not just the organ.
That's good. See, that was what I had always done. That's what I had planned from the 50 years ago. That's what I mean, that's what I heard. That's, and
First, I didn't know if it's in my head, am I imagining, or if
it's
it
in your
happens?
inner, no, I think it is the relationship of, I mean, I'm not a scientist, but I think it's something that happens with, it's a phenomenological, because, what was the name of your sociologist yesterday? Icho, he asked me what I thought about my recording from a very, very long time ago of strumming. And I said to him, you know, people, I mean, that piece became somehow had a certain importance. And people actually often use one of the words that I hate. I mean, I have probably 3 hate words in the vocabulary, and instead of my not saying them, I'll say them one time and I'll never say them again. The 3 hate words I have is minimalism, composing, and improvisation. I hate the 3 of them because I don't feel it applies to me anyway, and I don't even know what they mean, and they're overused, and if they were to disappear, I wouldn't care. I would celebrate. Okay. So, but but about my strumming piece of 1974, the recording I made was on a Revox, my own Revox. I had a it was made on a Bösendorfer piano. This is something that's for even now my show in Gesamtkunst Mischukeland, there's a Bösendorfer Imperial. That means it's the largest piano of its kind ever built. It was built in Vienna. It's a company that existed from 1830 even till now, although now it's owned by Yamaha because it's had a lot of financial problems. And it has 9 tones lower than any other piano in the world. So instead of having 88 keys, it has 97. And it was invented in 1900 supposedly under the advice of Ferruccio Busoni, the composer, kind of a experimental and sonic post-romantic composer of the first part of the 20th century, and he gave he had an idea, and he told the Bösendorfer family, and the Bösendorfer family had already worked with Franz Liszt. They were a family who liked composers, so they had sometimes a personal relationship, and so they made this piano, which they make now to this day, that has absolutely no reason to be made because there are only about 3 people in the entire world who use those other 9 notes, and I'm one of them. And I don't get them, and it's a fortune, these people. So actually, we own one, my wife and I, in Brussels. And the company rented us one here at the Kunsthalle. But it's, but the recording I made in 1974, it wasn't a very good quality recording. So it sounds very flat. I was trying to think of why after 50 years. I mean, it's not only my fault why they use that word minimalism so much, but it was because people sometimes when they describe, oh yes, you're Charlemagne Palestine, you're the one who did that piece where you play 2 notes for a whole hour and that's all you play. And I'm actually playing many notes. And if you hear it live, you hear like millions of like amoeba doing strange things that are incomprehensible, and you can't figure out, is it in my head or is it really happening? And that's how I started. But when it's recorded, it becomes flat. It's like 3D becoming 2D. Mm-hmm. So that's happily, even 2D people have found it interesting. But when you're really there and it's 3D, it's something else entirely, and there's no even a better like a B&W, the best speakers in the world can't do it. Why? Because like here, there are 2 speakers. Imagine the piece that I played on Friday, I must have played 380 pipes. You'd have to have 380 because each one came from its own source. It wasn't shared. I mean, it shared the air, but it didn't share the membrane, because these are membranes. So you'd have to have at least 380 speakers here in the room and recorded one by one, and I've never done that because I don't have the budget, though they tried to do it. I knew several people in California, and those in the period of like in the 60s and especially the 60s, there were a whole bunch of people trying to expand electronics and sonorities that finally became, you know, your home. Finally, they decided 5 is enough. But in those days, there were people who tried. The famous 1958 World's Fair in Brussels, Le Corbusier, with Xenakis was an architect, was his assistant, and they commissioned Edgar Varese to do a piece in a special kind of an architecture, a pavilion, which became the Phillips Pavilion, and it was a piece specially for this pavilion that had something like 100 speakers in it. I mean, people were interested in how that might like transform reality using electronics, but it never really it never took off, because finally live is better. Live is cheaper in the end. And then what are you going to do? Yeah, I mean, you have this enormous system. So it just never, so we got this home system that even now I don't think it's so popular anymore.
Yeah.
You know, the 5-1 home system. Yeah, surround system. I don't hear much about it anymore, just a few years
No,
ago.
now it's iPhone.
Yeah.
Now it's condensed again.
Yeah. So I mean, even that didn't last such a long time. I mean, I'm sure some people have it and it's great. You feel like you're in a movie theater when you're in your living room a little bit, but in the end, it's just too much trouble. So that's what I've been. You know, that's and bells do the same thing. You know, the other day, even in the recording I did in Innsbruck on this. I spelled carillon. The things because it was a fantastically enclosed, you're not always in a nice space, it was really a little like piazza in front of this St. Jakob of Innsbruck church. And so I played, and things that were happening phenomenologically were am I crazy? I never, what is that? I'm not very much acquainted with that, with sound like that, and that was my. That's where I arrived in my lifetime when I was hearing all that, hymnen and all these the 60s, 50s, 60s. Darmstadt, Columbia, Princeton, and all that post-serial music. I went another way, and even different from my colleagues that they try to always put me next to. Phil Glass was very metronomic. Steve Reich, metronomic. Even Terry Riley, more fantasy, but metronomic. John Adams, metronomic. And I'm sort of floating and looking for this, trying to find this inexplicable, am I dreaming, or what's out there and what's happening? And so that's even in my sense of rhythm is based on looking for those magic things. So I have no real sense of rhythm if anybody really listens, because they sometimes use the word repetition on me. That's another word I hate. forgot the fourth. Repetition, because I hate repetition. Just because I do something using the same thing a few times, but if I don't do it the same way any of the times, I think there needs to be other words for these things. And so I think repetition, when you like beep boop beep boop beep boop beep boop beep boop beep boop beep boop, that's close to repetition. But when you do whatever, my things every second is like I'm out of time, I'm out of tune. So it has to be out of repetition. But what word would you imagine is a word that means that you use something regularly but out of repetition? You don't have a word for that. Okay. So, for example, anybody else have anything that came up during that time, or about what they heard or felt? Like being in a church, was that difficult?
That was great.
It was great.
The best parts.
Yes? Why?
This is my
In your
question.
Yes?
Because it was, like for me, it was like a black mass.
A black mass. Okay. No,
But in
so,
a very elemental way, not in an ideological or religious way. Using a pop machine that for me organ is. It's a very pop machine.
pop. P-O-P.
Yes,
Pop,
pop
pop,
as
pop, pop, pop,
yeah,
pop, pop, pop,
as a jukebox of the birth.
okay, the
period,
jukebox
yeah?
of Christianity.
Yes, yes. And that's why the black mass. So,
Okay.
and you used it as an overtoning instrument, like a giant moog.
Yeah.
Which
Which was actually I knew Moog, I knew Moogs, I knew Buklas, I helped Serge invent his oscillators in the 70s, the Serge, what became the do-it-yourself synthesizer. He was the disciple of Bukla. I was around over there, and what I wanted lots of oscillators that would play overtones. And so, the problem was, first there are how to make an oscillator that was stable, because in those days everything, the weather, so they developed that, and then each one was a fortune that I didn't have, you know, and it didn't have the architecture. Organs have an architecture that it comes right with it. I mean, once you're there, they build a building normally, and then they build an organ for the building, and it's a kind of audio, a Gesamtsoundwerk.
Yeah, this is what I wanted to add. Like overtoning, as your technique you were describing, like this, for example, this is one of your earliest pieces, and the organ concerto is very...
Organ concerto.
Symphony?
Yeah, but I like it. Who's then am I accompanying? I'm accompanying the overtones. Then I just made me think of that. It's not if it's an organ concerto, that has to be a concerto. Normally you play with something. And so I would have to say that I'm playing the organ with the overtone, so it's a concerto for organ and its overtone.
The overtone needs specific place, because it's the place that is playing with you, the space itself.
Yeah.
So in both cases you are playing with the room, or with the church name.
To touch onto the Black Mass, I'm so familiar with churches and organs from childhood, so I associate that with that. But then there's a concerto music, and what you did with organ, to me, was completely magic. A great, unique, magical experience, musical experience, and totally different from anything I've heard before. So,
Luckily now it feels like that. Organs hate my music.
Of course.
Oh, well, because you've done something wonderful.
But strange enough, the organist here, he knows my music, He has actually played other instruments, and so he really knows it, and he likes it. So he's a very rare, he's the generation, but even the generation, his generation, it's taken a long time for young people to convince churches and organs to allow me to play. Because it's in a realm, I mean, some people say that the two big organ voices of that time was Messiaen and my music. But Messiaen was an organist. He was a titular organist for 56 years. So he was part of the club, because it's a very club-oriented, like a Freemasonry, you were using the term, a Freemasonry club of, so if you're not a member of that club, you have a lot of problems. And Messiaen was a member. In fact, all his life, even though he was professor, he traveled, he never gave up his chair as the organist of Trinity Church in Paris till the day he died. He was the 56 years. He was the non-stop official organist of Trinity Church, which was very important, even though, and then he stopped writing very much. He did these like fabulous, I got to hear, he stopped doing official organ pieces, but many Sundays he liked to do pieces in the moment. He called them, that word that I hate, improvisations, but I called them pieces in the moment, because I sensed their momentness, but he came from that generation where they use the word improvisation still. That wasn't a word that bothered him, but it bothers me that they use that for John Coltrane or Messiaen, or it's used in too many, every time, I had 10 people came for dinner and I didn't know what to serve them, so I sort of improvised, I mean, in those cases it works, but I'm not a good cook, so. So language, I find problems with language. I lived a little bit in Hawaii, for example, and they have about 30, they have a very small language, a Polynesian language, but certain words like how the waves move in water, they have about 30 words for different, like if it's straight or it's marked. So certain cultures become very sophisticated, even if though they're very few words, phenomenon that they're very attracted to, or because of their where they are and how they are very important in their life. They find many ways of differentiating. That's why I'm always amazed. This big global Western culture hasn't been able to find anything from repetition. Minimalism, I think, is one of the diseases of how can you be in such a diverse culture and everybody, when you use that word, people go gaga. It's like you've hit some kind. I don't know what that. Minimal restaurant, minimal hotel. Everybody goes gaga. It's so exciting. It's so exciting.
What then about the new trendy young generation of, I will use the word composers in the States that are called post-minimalists?
Yeah, well, but anyway, I always find that people like to use that term with me, and then I always say it's like not leaving a tip after a meal. The waiter would say, "What a fucking minimalist!" You didn't leave a sufficient tip. That for me.
But they would also use a lot of for your music and performances, and you would use it also trance.
Well, that's what we used to use it.
Yeah.
Before Tom Johnson started to coin that word minimalist, because I knew several of the important minimalist artists of the 60s and their descendants, and in their work, it was like really geometrical and flat and reductive, and that was really their That was what they wanted to do. That was their direction. And it lasted for a certain time, but not a half a century. Not a half a century.
No.
So I started, I can't imagine how hard it was for me. It took me 10 years. I just said, I'm not a min, I'm a max. I'm a maximal. Try it, say it. Took 10 years for like journalists. Try it. It's the same M, but there's an X there, and an A, maximum. And so even now they say, oh yes, the minimal composer, in another word I hate, minimal composer Charlemagne Palestine, who sees himself as maximal. Sometimes they do that.
Yeah.
I thought, so what are you listening to? What are you singing? This is all minimal to you? I mean, it's incredible. But this is a phenomenon now of the blind and deafness of our society. Okay, so that's it. It's one of the symptoms. I'm one of the proofs. It's like if you have an eye test. Somebody bring them in and see if they come up and look at me, watch me, all my guys and things, all my mashukka thing, and yeah, he's minimal. Then you know that they're totally blind, and that's it.
You mentioned they have diagrams, notes, etc. But many people don't know actually that you don't have written scores, and that all your music is attached to you, to your body, to your physical, psychological
Well, and also
experience.
to the phenomenon of like that Black Mass church
Yeah.
has a special kind of organ. You didn't know, but it has some of the buttons are pink, and some of their little parts are he saw them.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and they're little red things, really weird organ.
Because what does this button do? Huh? What are you experimenting, trying it on?
Well, no, I actually codified it right before. I had numbers. I had little.
So the pink color is.
Oh, you mean why did they put the pink color in that
Yeah.
thing? No explanation. Because others are white. I think somebody liked pink.
And you tend to like them.
Oh, I love it. I never played a pink. I never played a pink organ. Well, it wasn't all pink and red. Oh, but I would have designed it. I mean, that's the kind of organ. I like watching something that looks nice when I'm working. That's why I like to dress. I like to see colors, and I mean, if people don't like colors and like black, that's interesting too. But I would for an everyday diet, I prefer a colorful diet.
So what is the role of your teddy bear altar and?
They're divinities,
Okay.
What is the role? What do you think is the role? Do they have any role? They just sort of sit there. Do objects in front of you? What is the role of a painting when you go to a museum? What's the role? I mean, you used an interesting term. No. The interesting word is role, like role.
Yeah.
What does that mean in this case? Like an actor has a role.
Okay, the purpose.
Yeah. Okay.
So what is
Purpose.
the purpose of teddy bear altar
Yeah.
in the church, in your performance?
Well, if it wasn't a teddy bear altar, if I put an elephant, if I put a Maserati,
Yeah.
okay, no. So I asked you, you're watching. What does it? Obviously,
What
I'm
does it
trying to communicate something
Yeah.
visually, right?
Yeah.
Already. So it's like, and what if I put a Picasso in there? What would that mean to you? That it's a rich church, first of all. No, so
you leave the deciphering to us.
Oh, certainly, I leave the deciphering to you. I mean, I don't know. My role is that I do. That's why I don't like the word composing. I do. And what I did on Friday was to do. And these are all do's. There are historical things, which would be another story, about why I like and how I was born a Western child, very much influenced by Eastern, indigenous, and societies where there is an entire gesamt life form, where you pray, you dress, you sing, you dance, you sculpt, you live, your animism, all connected. That is much less in Western society and more in other societies that I've become in my lifetime acquainted with. So, I mean, why do Hindus have Ganesh? That's like an elephant god with a tummy like mine and a head like what's the role, you think, of Ganesh in Hinduism?
No idea.
Okay, well, that's a good answer. So I would say that.
I have the idea about children.
Oh, you do? So tell me that idea. I'm curious. Oh, no, I'm curious now. Your idea.
So teddy bear voodoo, you just explained.
Teddy bear voodoo. Is that what you use the word voodoo? I like that word. That's a word I like. I would prefer to be a voodooist than a composer. For example. That would be much, but people who are really into voodoo probably wouldn't like it.
No.
And pink voodoo and all this sort of guy.
They have the soundtrack already. So
Yeah, that's
on the safe side.
But some already named you a shaman. You know.
Yeah, but then they named others also.
Yeah.
For a long time, it was really funny because in video, when I first started these pieces, they called some of my pieces shaman, and then Namjoon Pak didn't like that they called me shaman, so he became the shaman. He was older than me. They even say invented video, so I had to give up that word. I mean,
So he had to be
I was sort of like a shamanette or something. He was the shaman, and I was the shamanette. Because in art, there's it's a lot of clashes of who's what in the military structure of who did first what and when, and I was bounced around a lot with that.
Yeah, because you could say like this piece, you could put it in the art categories, like in the video art, but you could also put it, it's very performative, you could put it also in the performance art. So I wonder, how did they gravitate you in these fields in the 70s when you started? Because you were acquainted with Marina Abramovic, with Ulay, with whom you performed in Maribor a couple of years ago, etc.
No, I met Marina, and she was a street artist. She was at the Parco in Rome. What's the name of that park? Villa Borghese. She was a street artist. I was doing a piece in an official festival, Contemporanea, in the parcheggio, the parking garage of the Villa Borghese. And upstairs, there was this woman, had a little table with a penknife, pocket knife. And she was doing this piece on the street. She had not yet really emigrated to the West, we could say. She had just come from Montenegro. And she was doing this piece. And actually, the story goes, is that she and I started to talk, and I said I have to go downstairs now and play again because I was on I was to be next. I was there with Simone Forti. I did a piece with, and we were supposed to do one more in the late afternoon. And I went downstairs in the parcheggio, which was fantastic acoustics, to play the Berzendorfer while Simone danced. And at a certain moment, which never happens, I was working on one of my strummings, and my finger slipped, which it never does. I mean, slipped to the point where you heard a kind of a false note, a mistake note, because I always include everything in my, that's a mistake. Like those two little, did you notice those two little stop action things that were in that piece? When it just stopped for me for a second and then it continued. That's not that's some magical thing, and I like it. So I hope it continues to do do that, but that wasn't my idea. That was the machine and whoever, the machine gods did that. Anyway, so I finish that piece and I go back upstairs and I'm sort of amazed. And I go and I see this woman who I didn't even know her name at that point yet, what she was, probably maybe Marina. And she has like a little band of tissue around one of her fingers. And she said to me, I said, what happened? Nothing, this never happens to me. The knife cut my finger. And so I said, it's funny because that never happens to me. I missed a note and I sort of made a mistake. And so she said, well, when? And so we tried to, in the last half an hour that had passed, because it happened, we seem to have imagined that it happened at the exact same moment that I was below and she was above. She cut her finger and I falsed a note. And that's how we became friends, actually. After that, she said, well, then you're like my brother. And so we remained friends. Now it's, I think it was around 1970. It's just about 40 years ago that story happened. And then I met Ulay after. Not even with her, I met Ulay differently. And then eventually, of course, they became a couple. And I've known them for, and then Ulay, and I sang. I forced him to sing as a performance in Maribor some years ago.
Mm.
And he lives here sometimes. I don't. Does anybody see him here anymore? Because he married this woman Lena. Because I didn't even contact her. It was a very strange experience. I mean, I'm pretty good always about making sure that I get paid for my events and to work it out, or if it's for free, then I do it for free. But they made a whole big deal, she made a whole big deal to invite me and Odd for this thing in Maribor. And then they did this whole official thing and I had to go to the Belgian embassy and everything like that. What's her name? And then we never got paid. I thought that was funny too, because Ulay is always an artist, so involved with artists' rights. That I thought it was funny that of all the people I should get screwed from, it was his new wife. And wait, I'll tell you her name.
But you know, out of this European capital of culture of Maribor, a lot of people got screwed up.
Oh,
I
yes?
think, with payment.
Her name is Lena Pislak. Does anybody know her? Okay.
Yeah.
That's Ulay's wife.
Yeah.
That's Ulay's wife. Oh, okay, so it's every, I mean, and I didn't know that I was like part of a team of
She
suckers.
lives,
Yeah.
they live, the first house near the Dragon Bridge.
Oh, yes?
Yeah.
We were there,
Dragon
yeah,
Bridge.
twice.
Yeah.
The first house near the dragon. On which side?
On the
Oh,
other
on the
side of
dragon's head. The
yeah,
dragon's head
on
side.
the other side of the market. So market
Okay.
is
Yeah.
This is on the left.
She has some kind of like an office or something too. She's like,
Yeah.
it's all there?
I think it's all there, yeah.
But does anybody ever see Ulay here?
I was told that he's here, but I can't.
Yeah, because he was ill. I mean, he has a cancer, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And he doesn't really take care of it because he likes to smoke and he likes to drink. And I think that he is resistant to change his. I would also be that. I mean, if tomorrow I would be resistant. I mean, I love to drink. I did give up smoking about 7 years ago.
So you don't use the special.
Oh,
cigar that
I
you-
haven't used that for 35 years.
Really?
It's still in my
Yeah, it's always-
Wikipedias.
yeah.
They talk about drink. So whenever I watch that, he smokes these cigarettes from Indonesia. I know that the critic has never seen me, met me, or anything, because anybody who's seen me or met me in the last 35
Yeah.
years knows that I don't do that anymore. I doubt, especially that special cigarette. So that shows you that often people who are critics, and they have such an important role in you, in people all over the world knowing who you are, don't know you at all. So that's like a funny little ha ha.
And maybe that's because, you know, smoke is half private stuff. So maybe he saw you on the concert and you didn't smoke, and the critic thought like, well, maybe today for this performance
yeah,
he
that's
didn't.
No, I think it's just these people who, like this photographer who comes quickly and doesn't stay.
Yeah.
So, you know, oh,
Yeah.
give me quickly a photo. And then it'll become my, you know, if it's a good photo, a wonderful portrait, it doesn't even know what I do. You know, I mean, no, that's not against him. It's just, it's a phenomenon that we find in our...
Were you ever asked to write a piece for somebody else? For a small ensemble, soloist, or that one of your pieces that was recorded and released, that somebody else would perform it?
I've had sometimes people play strummings,
Mm-hmm.
and normally they have, because there's no music, you have to come and work with me.
Yeah.
And I've done that a little bit like Indian musicians do that, and different, like indigenous musicians, oral tradition musicians. Even in the Jewish tradition, there are some cantorial traditions where you go and you sing with the chazan, and you learn it next to the chazan. There is some notation. Even Lamont Young and Terry Riley did that with Pranat. And there's no real... So actually now I'm going to play another version of this where I'm carrying the camera. That was done then 30, let's see, 2000, 74, 84, 94, 27 years later in color. Let me find it. That's called, what is it called? I forgot the name. I'll find it. It's called Ritual, in French actually, because I did it in France at the time. It was called Rituel dans le vide, which means ritual in the emptiness. So let me put this one on. Let's see how we do this. Into full screen. And let's do that one.
You were still smoking here
Huh?
at that time.
Huh?
Were you
Oh,
still
you mean
smoking?
because I breathe heavy.
No, just
Was I smoking? Yeah, I was still smoking. Cigarillos. 5 or 6 little cigarillos a day. Those Davidoff things.
no.
People were always buying me the Davidoff, so I was smoking the best killer cigarillos, mini cigarillos in the world. I have so many left, they're just sitting there, getting wasted. Stopped. So that was I was invited, there used to be this fabulous sort of foundation in France named after the composer Pierre Chauffeur, who was one of the founders of musique concrète, which means using different sound effects and things around and then electronically manipulating them. And there was another guy who didn't even know very well Pierre Chauffeur, and named the foundation after him. And you could go to this, it's where Citroën was, the region near to Belfort and in the center of France. Peugeot. And they had a big, maison de maître, like a chateau, and they invited artists to come for 20 years to do projects in media. And they invited Aud and I, and we stayed there for about a week. And this was an ancient company of sewing machines and things made with enamel that had gone bust, called Yappi. It had been very famous in the early part of the century. And it was now, like you see, an emptiness. It was one of the factories. And so I was attracted by the emptiness of this. It was even almost a village full of places like this. And so it's called then Ritual in the Emptiness. And by then I'm using these small cameras, of course, and I'm running and I'm holding it myself. There's no editing. The divinities, two of the divinities that are here today were there. That was like, I did that piece 15 years ago now, 14, 15, so they've aged. I've aged more than they do. They don't seem to age exactly.
Can you finish the story with divinities?
There is no finishing story to the divinities. Well, there is a funny story, actually. A funny story that only came later. Because I found out, here I am, a child, like every child, playing with my toys. I hate that word too. I prefer divinities to toys. Well, there are things that are toys, but these guys aren't toys, they're divinities, but okay. And so I start, like all kids, to like my favorite bears and things when I'm a child in Brooklyn, in a certain neighborhood in Brooklyn, which is near to what they call Brownsville, East Flatbush, which is still not a neighborhood that the arty-farty world has come to, because Brooklyn is very big. Now Brooklyn is the cultural capital of the world. When I was a kid, it was the violence and race conflict capital of the world 50 years ago. Now it's the place to be. But my neighborhood is still so far from, like, it's 12 miles from the Empire State Building. I did that because I was brought up in this neighborhood that was like a refugee neighborhood, Jewish refugees, near to then what was now encrusting on new Jamaican people who had come also to find the American dream, the Brooklyn dream. And so it was, but in that neighborhood there was nothing cultural, and happily there was television already. My mother wanted me to be more cultural. My parents were born in Eastern Europe. My father was born in Odessa, and his family moved to New York, and most of them moved to Brighton Beach, Coney Island, which is what we even now still call Little Odessa, on the Atlantic Ocean. And my mother was born in Minsk, and her mother was born in Krakow, so not so far from me. And then she married my grandfather from Minsk, and they went to New York too, all before the Russian Revolution, to find a better life, and on boats and tearing up their papers, not so different than what we see in the my father's side. They were, I don't know if many of you know the film Potemkin and the famous conflict between the boat and the shore of workers, and my father's side of the family, right after Potemkin, decide to, though we don't know the details, decide to emigrate to America. And on my mother's side, they come a few years later, but just before the Russian Revolution. And so they settled in the Lower East Side. I don't know if any of you have been to New York City, like Katz's Delicatessen, and there are like a whole bunch of there's even now a museum of Tennant's museum. They were born just like 3 blocks from there. And then they moved, like my generation of my parents, you were like 6 people in a room and things like that. And push carts on the street, people that just love. So there was too much, so people started to move when you were younger. Members of the family got younger, you had children, a lot of them started to move to Brooklyn because it was cheaper. You had 1 tree or 2 even. And so it became, but then it was a different kind of, the mafia, there was a Jewish mafia. And my father worked for the Jewish mafia in building, and my mother had come from textiles. And her father had a awning shop in Williamsburg. Williamsburg now is one of the most, that's like Monaco. If you have a place it's like you have a house in Monaco. But that's where my grandfather had his awning sweatshop in Brooklyn. And so, let's go back. I'm a kid in Brooklyn playing with my toys. Then eventually I sang a lot, and because of that I won a scholarship to the High School of Music and Art, which was in Manhattan. And then after that I'm all in like the cultural, all my student friends, their fathers, mothers won Pulitzer Prizes or on Broadway, things like that. So all of a sudden I'm in a cultural environment, and I was a good student. I absorbed all that and became, but my mother wanted me to be cultural, and I was always curious about everything. So it finally worked out, and I became who I became, but I had to move out of that place, because that 12 miles away could just as well have been in the mountains of Tyrol, or here someplace out in a farm, nothing, no connection. But now I'm playing with all these toys, and then, but they talk, I communicate with my parents like that, and then my mother says he's getting too old, and I'm going to make the story fast because I want to get to the last part of the story, which is the story, part of the story which only now is really interesting and important for the future, even an expo I'll have next year at the Jewish Museum in New York City, which is just down the street from the Guggenheim. So I play with these toys. I'm too old. My mother gets rid of them. As I get older again, somebody gives me a bear that has blue eyes like mine. I get involved again, and now I'm in university, and it becomes sort of, I start doing performances, and these guys, I call them the guys, even though some are gals, 2 guys, gals, they're with me. Group, the early group, then there's a red suitcase, as you notice, there's a little red suitcase. Then starts this tradition of that I'm always traveling with a group of my family. So then they become my family from toys. They became guys and gals, and then it became my family. And then I travel with his family, and I began to become a trademark of this Misha, the guy who makes all the sounds, performances, always traveling with this red suitcase with all these weird toys, and that becomes me. And then in 1986, 87, it becomes possible because of I'm invited for Documenta, and finally they've decided, right after Joseph Beuys and Andy Warhol dead, they did several months one to the other, and they decide on a Documenta with more performance and media to make it more equal. They give up a job to a woman named Elizabeth Yapa, who had a Malkarai of performance, a kind of transitional museum in the 80s, we could say. A place where you could do all kinds of performance and inexplicables or explicables with your body, you use anything. It was an open to all possibilities. And she became the assistant director of Documenta. She invited me, and I go to the Steiff Teddy Bear Company in Germany with a project that I would build this bear with 3 heads and 2 bodies. And I arrive, and I get to meet through lots of help. I had to have intermediaries who called the president of the company because of this guy coming out of nowhere to work with the most important teddy bear company in the world. They're the ones with the button in the ear. They're also one of the most expensive in the world. They still exist. They're near Stuttgart. So I went and I met the chief designer, who was the great nephew of Margareta Steiff, who was a woman who had polio, who actually started the company. And so I arrive and we have a meeting, official meeting, and he asked me about myself. I said, yes, I come from Brooklyn. And from Brooklyn, he says? Yes. I come from a place that's sort of called East New York, Brooklyn. I said, yeah. To tell you, people think that we invented the teddy bear in 1902, but we actually didn't invent the teddy bear. There's a couple from East New York in Brooklyn called the Mitchums, and they invented the teddy bear. And so I only learned this like in 1987, so I'm already 40 years old, and I've been already traveling. Later on, I find out that not only did these people live in Brooklyn, but they live, now there's more and more, in the Jewish Virtual Library internet site, you can see the whole story of this couple who were not related to me specifically, but they also came from the same part of Eastern Europe earlier than my parents. And so I was actually born 2 or 3 kilometers from where the teddy bear was invented. And so in 1902. So if one were to take my Meshuggah philosophy, that I have Shar the world, and I'm sort of my own tribe, and I've been going around the world doing my, that's my, one could be crazy enough to also say then that the teddy bear is my uncle.
Architect.
Well, yeah, but also my uncle. He comes from the same neighborhood from Jew. He's a Jewish bear, and he has a little bit of a nose sometimes too, like we have. And he came from my neighborhood, so there. So the funny thing is that now I'm going to have a show at the Jewish Museum in New York, as I know Claudia Gould, and it's a very progressive Jewish museum. It's not just any old. They're very much into contemporary art and that. And so I'm working with a guy who's been there the longest time, Norman Kleeblatt, and he knows about how these toys have been following me all over my life. And then I happened to tell him, that they're the original teddy bear that the people who, they asked Teddy Roosevelt, because it's named after the president, at a certain moment in history. You have to read Jewish Virtual Library teddy bear, and he'll tell the whole story. It's a very beautiful story, but that's a whole afternoon. That's a half an hour story. And so, in the Smithsonian is the bear that the company sent to Teddy Roosevelt, and I went to go and see it with Ord several years ago, and now we're going there. The Jewish Museum of New York will be able to lend it, and so we're going to try to find a way, I'm an artist in the last 50 years, international now, come from a certain neighborhood in Brooklyn, and I do all these different things, Gesamtkünstler, blah, 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 blah. And then these divinity toys come from his neighborhood, invented by a Jewish couple that could have been his aunt and uncle. And so if he has his first Schmunman show at the Jewish Museum, maybe he should be there with his Uncle Teddy, the real one from the Smithsonian. And that's what we're working on for next time. That I'll have my Schmunman Schmetrospective with my Uncle Teddy divinity toy. And so I think that's a good way to, yeah, because it's 1 o'clock.
Yeah.
So any other last little, and there's the cognac that I drink always, I do still drink when I play cognac. It was there, that's the rest of the bottle, and you're all invited to take a little schnapps schnook in honor of our having done this all together. If you like, if you don't, you don't have to, but it's there. I'm even gonna, normally I dump it just for the taste, or they'll be a little pissed at me, taking a cognac at 1 o'clock, but I'm just with you guys. Exceptionally on a Sunday afternoon, take a little schnapps. So thank you. No, don't clap. I hate you. And you didn't clap so well the other day. You were lousy clappers. You were lousy clappers now, so I don't want you to have the satisfaction of finishing with a good clap. Put them in the room there. Yeah. Okay. So they have a little song for you. Okay. Are you on?
Yes.
Okay. No clapping for the moment. Wait, it's not finished. No clapping. It's not finished. Bye, bye, bye. Okay, now we can clap.